The realm of folklore has, within academia, sometimes been questioned as a pseudo-discipline, one which deals with the mystical, the intangible, and the ludicrous. However, it is my belief that folklore holds valuable information about the ways in which societies conceptualize and interact with the natural world, other humans, and the divine. Instead of dismissing the folktales of cultures, I shall attempt instead to display some of my musings upon them. In particular, this paper will deal with the origins, evolution, and purpose of the vampire within folklore. As a Byzantinist, I've limited my investigations to the societies inhabiting the southeastern European and Middle Eastern worlds, which are rich in accounts of vampiric creatures. This paper will also extend beyond the confines of medieval history and consider both the classical and modern forms of the vampire, and attempt to answer any questions of why vampires exist. Firstly, let us come to a definition of a vampire. Modern dictionaries define a vampire as a corpse that rises at night to drink the blood of the living. This formula for vampiric activity has been augmented with additions such as a ravenous libido and immortal beauty to create the recognisable characteristics of a vampire in the modern age. These additions have acted to make vampirism seem desirable in a number of ways. Vampires can be beautiful, sexually desirable, or funny, depending on the audience. This is seen in classic works, such as The Twilight Saga, and the film Lesbian Vampire Killers, and even in children's media such as Hotel Transylvania. The recent film Dracula Untold recasts Vlad Tzipis Draculeshti as a fair and wise ruler who utilises every means possible, including vampirism, to protect his people and his family from an ultimate invasion. With such noble intentions, Vlad is reimagined from Impaler and Monster into the hero of the tale. To put it succinctly, the vampire of today is cruel. Such a definition of a vampire, however, would sit at odds with the conceptualization of the creature through previous periods of history. Indeed, the image, purpose, and causes of vampirism regularly change throughout history, and it's the hope of this paper to chart some of these transformations. In order to fully understand the previous incarnations of the vampire, it is necessary to remember that the modern definition is the result of a post-Enlightenment emphasis upon scientific categorization. As such, the contemporary vampire has been reduced to a small set of familiar characteristics, and a number of historic traits have been set aside. It is imperative to keep an open mind as to the nature of a vampire, because, as this paper will show, it changed a lot. With this in mind, I will now proffer some examples of vampiric creatures in the classical world and how they have evolved through the medieval period. Although scholars such as Berkowski claim that the vampire is a Slavic creature in origin, and as such can be traced back to the 9th century, there is evidence for a vampire-like creature in Assyrian and Babylonian folklore. A tablet, translated by Thomson and interpreted as a spell of protection, states, "They have come from the grave, the evil spirit, the evil demon. They rage against mankind. They spill their blood like rain, devouring their flesh and sucking their veins, ceaselessly devouring blood." Clearly, we have a vampire. Flesh-eating is perhaps one of the most common traits of a vampire present in the primary sources. In the Mesopotamian case, we know of a quasi-divine entity known as Lamashtu, which is said to eat the flesh of people and snatch away newborns who were breastfeeding. Similarly, we have the demon Lilith, known by the Judaic incarnation of Lilith. Lilith, according to some non-Talmudic sources, was said to eat flesh, but in this instance it was the flesh of illegitimate children. The specific targeting of mothers and children is another common trope of vampires in the ancient world, and perhaps reflects some of the social anxieties of an infant and child mortality. As the vitality of a mother appeared to be drained, so people would blame a vampire-like entity. Likewise, the Lamia of Greece was also believed to prey upon children in revenge for the actions of Hera in killing her own. What is clear from this, however, is that there were certainly vampire-like creatures inhabiting the classical mindscape long before the arrival of the Slav peoples to Byzantium around the 8th and 9th centuries. We should be conscious of these classical precursors to the vampire legend and how they may have shaped vampire lore in these cultures, in our case, those of the Eastern Roman Empire and its neighbours. Demons in the classical world, unlike in the later medieval period, were considered part of the furniture of nature. They were not part of a dualistic, morally binary, eschatological framework with some form of eternally envisioned overseer. Instead, they operated in a more morally ambiguous world, and were not considered to be fundamentally evil as we would imagine. From this basis, there appears to have developed in classical Greek thought the possibility that demons were a manifestation of mental illness. We have an interesting manuscript in which a collection of doctors identify lycanthropy as a specific mental illness and go on to describe its manifestation in a person and recommend treatment. Instead of physically transforming into a wolf-like creature, a person simply adopted wolf-like behaviour. This has a basis in modern explanations of werewolves and vampires, with conditions such as porphyria cited. It would be intriguing to see if ancient cultures also have considered vampirism in a similar light. However, no known manuscripts survive, and we are left to conjecture. If we step outside the Western world briefly, we can draw similarities in nature between these creatures and spirits and the jinn of Arabian folklore. In the Quran, jinn are neither of mankind nor the angels, but constitute a third sapient being. They can be either benign or malevolent, and like humans, possess a semblance of free will. The spirits of the classical world, which would become the demons of the Christian, were significantly morally ambiguous, like the jinn. These demons, although capable of socially abhorrent acts, were not manifestations of evil upon earth, but instead a part of a natural world that was replete with unexplainable phenomena to the ancient peoples. They represent, in my opinion, philosophical and metaphysical struggles and anxieties of society, such as the taboo surrounding child mortality or cannibalism. This distinction of morality between a deist-driven monstrousness and a natural state of spirit-demon being becomes significant in the late Roman period with the adoption of Christianity. Tenets of the Christian faith, such as the holy goodness of God, the creation of the world by Him, and the dogma of redemption through Jesus Christ, all present instances of incompatibility with parts of the pagan world. Where exactly did creatures such as the vampire fit into a Christian worldview? What is known is that early Christians certainly believed in demons. In the Spiritual Meadow of John Muscus, he advises apprentice monks to recite the Psalms to repel the fancies of demons, and they appear in a number of hagiographical texts and even literature. Although some of these apparitions appear humorous to a contemporary audience, such as an instance of demonic pigs in a sex life, or the incompetent demons in the Timalion, the presence of demons in everyday life was a great concern to the inhabitants of the Christian world. Athanasios, Bishop of Alexandria, expanded the view that demons were the agency behind the persecution of Christians. Consequently, demons have gone from beings of the natural world to agents of the devil. Cyril Mango theorizes that this interpretation of demons was instrumental to the Church. Prior to the adoption of Christianity by the Romans, it had been the Roman state that had persecuted and mobilized the Christians, with the threat of persecution by the Roman state removed by its incorporation. Mango claims that the Church needed a new threat against which to cast itself. While there were physical enemies, such as the Sassanids in Iran, which posed a significant threat, demons occupied both the temporal and the spiritual world. Their presence in both required the Church to continue its presence in the everyday lives of its adherents, in order to repel the physical manifestations of demons and their malevolent acts, and the spiritual implications of evil. While I feel that there is an element of opportunism within certain parts of the Church, I am also of the opinion that the Church struggled to eliminate all aspects of culturally pagan parts of the community. Instead, the lesser deities of pagan cults, the nymphs, the magical creatures and the spirits, were recast as the level of demons, acting in opposition to the revelation of the true faith. This has thus far been a brief and very swift account of some mentions of vampirism in the classical and late Roman world. I will now turn to examine the Byzantine perception of a vampire. This will involve reference to archaeological material, primary texts, and a very liberal approach to anthropology. You have been warned. As stated above, the early church struggled to reconcile the world created by God with accounts of pagan creatures, such as the vampire, which arguably served to validate pagan beliefs in the face of the Christian revelation. The answer, according to Athanasios and Mango, was to recast them as agents of the Christian devil. In the period between the 4th and 7th centuries, therefore, demons seemed to turn to manipulation in order to bring evil to the world. The instances of demonic possession in the texts increased, and the immoral or flawed actions of men are the result of demonic influence. Most famously, we can see this in the supposed possession of the Emperor Justinian in the secret history of Procopius. He spins his head and turns green and vomits. It's very exorcist. Vampires, however, seem to drop out of vogue in this period. Evidence from the Suda, a lexicon of Greek terms compiled in the 10th century, demonstrates that there was still some knowledge of the concept of a vampire, but it is really with the arrival of the Slavs in the 9th century that vampires begin to reappear. The Suda records the classical terms for a vampire, a yellow or mormor, but it also records more concisely the term vrikolakas. The word is Slavic in origin, deriving from varkolak, meaning wolf head, and it is accepted that vampiric and werewolf lore became interchangeable sometime in the 7th or 8th century. From the 9th century, the vrikolakas appeared more frequently in folk accounts, and the name eventually enters contemporary parlance in mainland Greece and Asia Minor. Interestingly, Crete, which did not experience Serbian occupation in the 9th century and the subsequent Slavic cultural influence, does not use the word vrikolakas, but instead has the name katachas for a vampire. I have thus far been unable to determine the etymology for this name, but it is obviously the inspiration for the Katakan vampire in the Witcher series. The use of vrikolakas has continued in modern Greece. Aside from etymology, there is also archaeological evidence for a belief in vampires. Central to this evidence is the supposed physical remains of vampires themselves, recorded in deviant burials. These graves have featured in news reports and documentaries, but have, unfortunately, in a Byzantine context, received little to no scholarly attention. I therefore warn you about the quality of my conclusions, based upon fragmentary news reports and the odd academic journal article. The majority of these deviant burials are found in Bulgaria, but also some in Anatolia, and as the name suggests, deviate from the norms of medieval orthodox burial as we would understand them. For instance, some graves have been found with ploughshares placed across the neck, others with limbs specifically broken post-mortem, or even beheaded, and others are simply not facing east towards the Holy Land. The use of a ploughshare has been typically associated with Bulgarian apotropaic practices, signifying that the Slavic peoples in the empire may have believed in the existence of vampires. Likewise, breaking of bones appears to have been a common apotropaic practice right across Europe. There had been an impetus stemming in some measure from quixotic and misguided sentiment to associate these graves with vampires. While such associations are exciting and serve to confirm a number of our assumptions about the medieval world, there are, in my opinion, issues with this course of burial archaeology. Firstly, there is a tendency to consider all deviant acts in anthropology as somehow linked to ritual. In some cases, it is not even proven that the graves are Christian, and there are equally plausible explanations for some of these discrepancies in known burial practices. These could quite feasibly be the burials of criminals, in which case post-mortem mutilation is certainly possible. We should therefore be cautious about assigning all deviances from the norm as ritualistic and mystical. These issues aside, however, when we consider the apotropaic actions present in particular graves and compare them to more recent practices in keeping the dead at rest, there are similarities. These include the breaking of certain bones or using iron nails to literally fasten the corpse to the coffin. It is plausible then that some of these burials were for those considered to be vampires. The vampire was then back in vogue in the High Byzantine period. These coincidences interestingly occur with another important event in the medieval period, and one which vampires long held association. This was the sporadic outbreak of disease and plague. Periods of epidemic in the medieval world were readily explained by vampiric activity. The pollution caused by sin, in a similar way to classical constructions of pollution, could have physical manifestations such as plague, which was said to be spread by vampires. Most notoriously is the period of Black Death, which saw supposed cases of vampirism rise throughout Europe, not just in the East. We can approximate the fear of plague with the fear of the outsider. There are accounts which identify an outsider as a potential vampire who has come to spread disease and feed upon the village. Vampires are plague bearers, demonstrates a continuing fear of the dead in the consciousness of the medieval mind. This is arguably a remnant of classical thought concerning the dead, where ritual and due process in burial was vital. If we further examine the state of the corpse, we can see this similarity with ancient rites concerning the correct treatment of the dead. According to Greek law, there are a number of ways one can become a vampire, including leading an incredibly sinful life and being the product of an incestuous union. Slavic law has further rich traditions of the transformative process, including the state of the birth of a child. One way in which one can become a vampire, which seems consistent with most accounts, however, is the body being stepped over by either an animal or person. Scholars have linked this act with classical traditions concerning reverence for the body and the period of delay between death and the ascension of the soul. Consequently, there is a short period where the deceased is exposed, both literally and spiritually, and it is the responsibility of the relatives to care for the body. This is shown in Sophocles' Antigone, for example. where the consequences for maltreatment of a corpse that died. The image of the Furies as enforcers of these social norms is claimed by some academics to be the basis for the Dracula of Greek law. In showing disrespect to a body by allowing animals to step over it, the custodians of the body, the family, are due for punishment. And according to law, the punishment is twofold. As well as the vampire feeding upon its relatives, making them ill and eventually killing them, the soul of the deceased is eternally cursed, prevented from entering heaven. As can be imagined, this would obviously be extremely troubling for a Greek villager, and so great lengths are taken to prevent the transformation of a deceased family member into a vampire. The damnation of a person's soul for simply being stepped over seems extreme and incompatible with the Church's teachings on ultimate redemption in Christ. Such beliefs, however, have persisted into the modern era. While the Church officially rejects vampirism, the lower levels of the clergy frequently appear in accounts of countering a vampire. This interpretation of a vampire, as a consequence of a sinful or neglectful life, has continued on in early modern and modern Greek culture. Before Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1897, Western travellers to Ottoman and former Ottoman lands, from Britain, France and Germany, had introduced to a Western audience to this version of the vampire. This marks the beginning of the period of so-called vampire fever. To a Western audience with a tradition of Enlightenment and Protestant rationalism, the fervent belief by locals in myths such as vampires must have seemed quaint and charming. This presents us with an interesting case in how vampires could be, and were, utilised for specific purposes. In this case, the existence of these creatures in the mindscape of the rural peasantry served to reaffirm the superiority of the Western colonial powers over perceived lesser nations in and around Europe. Belief in vampires was one way in which nations could be demoted to inferior status in the eyes of rational Western audiences. For instance, the Western world struggled with how to receive modern Greece. Greece had been the birthplace of classical Greek culture, the supposed foundation for the entirety of the Western world, and was so revered as a sort of mythical homeland, if you will. Yet the modern Greeks failed to live up to the lofty ideals of the West. In order to deal with the Ottoman domination of Greece, the lack of classical traits in its people, and its almost heretical beliefs in Greek orthodoxy, the West produced a narrative of backwardness, applicable to all nations under the Ottoman yoke. A belief in vampires merely served to confirm both the superiority of the West and the terrible consequences of Orthodox Christian and later Muslim rule. They never should have abandoned their classical world. From the mid-1700s then, there are a flood of accounts from the recently opened Ottoman Empire, telling of a mystical world in which superstition played a significant part. These tales included many of vampiric activity, and even a dissection of a supposed Dracula on the island of Lesbos for a very lucky French traveller. These are not only confined to the Greek world. In his translation of 1001 Nights, Galland includes the story of Sidi Numa, in which his wife is revealed to be a ghoul, a monster of pre-Islamic Arabia, which, according to the story, feasts upon human flesh. The story has led many, including academics, to make comparisons between European vampires and Eastern counterparts. However, the folklorist William Kirby utterly refutes this story and instead states that the story has Greek or Turkish origins. He is correct that there are remarkably no other examples of vampirism in the Arabic world. This can therefore be seen as an orientalizing exercise on the part of modern Europeans. However, it is certainly true that some modern Greeks continue to hold stock in the folkloric traditions of their culture. Interviews with late 19th century immigrants from Greece to the United States have revealed accounts of Dracula, and there were even stories of vampires from Pontic Greeks fleeing the events of the 1920s. By no means should these tales be scoffed at. To do so would be to impose a Western sense of superiority over countless centuries of alternative cultures. Instead, we should consider folklore in the wider context of social history, as it can reveal great truths which govern people before the age of rationality. And I'll throw open to questions.